welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the complete lore of Dark Souls. This is a world built from ash and ember, from gods who faded and men who refused to, from fire that was never meant to last and darkness that was never meant to end. It is a world of ancient cycles, of kingdoms raised on borrowed time, of heroes who became hollow and hollows who became legend. Every stone in this world remembers something. Every fog-shrouded ruin was once a throne room. Every cursed wanderer was once someone's child. What unfolds tonight is the full, unbroken story. From the age of ancients, when grey crags stretched beneath an ashen sky, through the discovery of fire and the rise of the gods, through the founding and fall of Lordran, through the curse that unmade the world and the chosen undead who walked through the ruin of it all. We will follow Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, from his moment of triumph to his last desperate act. We will watch Nito sleep among the dead, and the Witch of Izalith reach for something she could not hold. We will trace the slow unraveling of Anor Londo, the corruption beneath Blighttown, the quiet grief of Ash Lake, and the terrible thing that waits at the end of the kiln. This is the story of how fire became a promise that could not be kept, and how that promise shaped everything. Whether you are uncovering these details for the first time, letting familiar echoes carry you back into a world you have wandered before, or simply allowing the tale to wash over you like smoke rising from dying embers as sleep draws close, this will carry you through the full, unbroken lore of Dark Souls. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if this kind of slow, immersive storytelling feels like something worth returning to. And if you leave before the fire fades, you'll never know what Gwyn did at the end, or why it changed everything. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was no light. There was no darkness either, not truly. There was only the grey, a vast and featureless expanse of ancient stone and ancient silence, stretching in all directions without horizon or boundary. The world existed, but it did not yet breathe. Enormous dragons moved through it, creatures of grey scale and impossible stillness, as much a part of the landscape as the crags they rested upon. They were called the Everlasting Dragons, and they were old in a way that cannot be measured. Old in the way stone is old. Old in the way that something is old when it has never been young. They did not rule the world so much as they occupied it, the way mountains occupy a range, effortlessly and without intention. The trees in this age were stone. The fog that drifted between the peaks carried no moisture. The sky above was the same grey as everything below, and nothing moved through it with purpose. It was a world without narrative, without change, without the tension that comes from one thing wanting to become another. It simply was, as it had always been, as it seemed it would always be. This was the age of ancients, and it might have lasted forever if something had not been found in the dark. Beneath the grey crust of the world, beneath the roots of the stone trees and the foundations of the crags, there was a place of deeper nothing. And within that deeper nothing, something had been waiting, not sleeping, waiting in the way that fire waits inside stone, in the way that a sound waits inside silence. When it was finally disturbed, when the grey world above shifted in some imperceptible way, the first flame kindled. No one knows precisely what the first flame was. The scholars who would later study it could only describe what it did. It divided. Where before there had been only grey sameness, only the monotony of the everlasting dragons and the featureless sky, there was now a split. a fundamental separation between opposites. Life and death became distinct where once they had blurred together. Heat and cold separated into different sensations. Light and dark, which had never truly existed as concepts, suddenly were. And within that splitting, within the friction and the warmth of opposition, something else emerged that had never existed before: souls. Not the small, scattered souls that would later drift through the world like embers in a dying fire. Something deeper than that, something vast enough to be called Lord souls. They were found near the first flame, resting in the dark around its light, and they were claimed by 4 beings who had not existed until that moment, or who had existed but had never been significant until they were given something enormous to carry. The first was Nito. He would later be called the First of the Dead, the Grave Lord, the Master of Death and Disease. But in that first moment, he was simply a being drawn to the largest of the souls near the flame, a soul that carried within it the weight of mortality, the idea that living things could stop living. He took it and it changed him, filling him with an understanding of death so complete that he became a kind of death himself, wrapped in burial robes, wreathed in the bones of the fallen, hollow at his core in a way that was not emptiness but presence, the presence of every ending. The second was the Witch of Izalith, and she was accompanied by her daughters, which suggested that some form of life had already begun before the flame was found, or that the flame's emergence was what made her and her lineage possible simultaneously. She found a soul near the flame that hummed with the warmth of creation, with the possibility of making things that had not existed. She was drawn to its generative power, to the promise that fire could be wielded as a tool, that the first flame was not simply a fact of the world, but a resource. She did not yet know what that ambition would cost her. The third was a furtive pygmy, small and overlooked, and mentioned only briefly in the oldest accounts of this time. He found the dark soul, and it was the strangest of the Lord souls, the one that seemed to resist description. It was not as bright as the others, not as immediately powerful, not as easy to understand, but it contained something that the others did not, a kind of depth, an interiority, a quality that later scholars would recognize as the seed of humanity itself. The pygmy took the dark soul and receded, and is not spoken of again in any of the great histories, but what he carried would echo through everything that followed. The fourth was Gwyn, and he found the soul of light, the most visible and the most commanding of the souls near the flame. Light, in a world that had only recently invented the concept of illumination, was an extraordinary thing. It revealed, it warmed, it drove back the grey and made visible what the age of ancients had kept formless. Gwyn was drawn to its power the way that power draws those who understand how to use it, and he took the soul of light and was transformed by it, becoming something beyond whatever he had been, radiant and commanding, and utterly convinced of his own right to lead. These 4, Nito, the Witch of Izalith, the furtive pygmy, and Gwyn, became the great lords of the New Age. And because they had found their power near the first flame, because their authority derived from that original fire, the age they would create was called the Age of Fire. But first, the dragons had to be dealt with. The everlasting dragons were not evil, not in the way that the word would come to be understood. They were simply ancient and resistant to change, and change was exactly what the New Lords represented. The world that the flame had illuminated was a different world from the one the dragons had occupied for so long, and the dragons, being creatures of the grey undead, being creatures of scales that could not be harmed and forms that could not be ended, simply continued to exist in the old way, while everything around them became the new way. The conflict was perhaps inevitable. Gwyn was the one who prosecuted it most directly. He commanded a sunlight that could strike, not merely illuminate, and he sent that sunlight against the scales of the dragons in concentrated bolts that struck something no scale could protect. The soft places, the hidden vulnerabilities. His silver knights rode beside him, armies of beings who had been shaped by the flame's emergence and who wielded spears of light that could pierce what the grey age had made inviolate. The war was longer than any single account captures fully, because the dragons were so vast and so deeply rooted in the world that simply fighting them was not enough. What finally turned the tide was betrayal. Seth the Scaleless was a dragon who was different from the others. He had been born without scales, without the immortality that the scales provided, and this had made him an outcast among his own kind, looked upon with the mixture of contempt and unease that any community reserves for those who are imperfectly like them. Seth had spent his existence studying the thing that had been denied to him, researching the nature of the everlasting dragon's immortality with a scholarly obsession that was equal parts envy and genuine inquiry. And when Gwyn came to war against the dragons, Seth made a decision. He shared what he had learned. He gave Gwyn the knowledge of how to strip the dragons of their stone scales, how to expose them to harm, how to finally end what had seemed unendable. With Seth's betrayal, the war turned. The dragons fell one by one, their bodies crumbling into ash and stone, their vast presences fading from a world that had decided it no longer had room for them. The everlasting dragons were not entirely destroyed. Some slept in places so deep and so forgotten that even Gwyn's armies could not reach them, and their descendants and cousins would endure in corners of the world for ages to come. But the age they had defined was over. Gwyn rewarded Seth for his treachery generously. He gave him a dukedom in the city that would be built in the wake of the war. He gave him access to archives and resources for his continuing research. He granted him the title of Duke and, later, a shard of his own lord's soul, which gave Seth a form of the immortality he had always craved, even if it was not the natural immortality of his scales. It was, in retrospect, a deeply troubling exchange, rewarding betrayal with power, gifting the thing most desired to the one who had proven himself most willing to betray to get it. But Gwyn did not think in those terms. Gwyn thought in terms of utility, in terms of what served the Age of Fire, and Seth's betrayal had served it extremely well. The other great allies of Gwyn's war were similarly rewarded. The four kings, warriors of enormous power who had fought at Gwyn's side, were granted fragments of his lord's soul and given dominion over the city of New Londo, a great settlement that would be carved into the cliff walls of the land. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters were given the southern reaches of the emerging kingdom, the deep and warm places where the fire's influence ran hottest. Nito retreated into the earth itself, into the deepest tomb that could be found, and there he presided over death in the way that the earth presides over the dead, quietly and completely, and without any need for acknowledgement. And in the center of everything, Gwyn built Anna Londo. Anna Londo was the crown of the Age of Fire, and it was built to look exactly like that. Like a crown, like the highest and most unreachable thing in the world, set into cliffs so steep and so high that the clouds drifted through its outer courtyards as a matter of course. It was a city of silver and gold, of cathedral spires that caught the light of the sun and held it, of vast halls where the light of Gwyn's own soul made the stone glow with a warmth that was almost alive. The gods who lived there, and they called themselves gods because what else would you call beings who had shaped the world from formlessness, moved through those halls with the assurance of those who had always owned everything, because in a meaningful sense they had. The architecture of Anor Londo was not merely beautiful, it was designed to be overwhelming. The scale of the doorways exceeded what any human body required, so that entering any chamber meant being immediately reminded of one's own smallness. The ceilings of the great halls were high enough that the upper reaches vanished into shadow, implying spaces larger than the eye could verify. The statues of the gods were enormous, looking down with expressions that were serene in the way that enormous power can afford to be serene. Not because the world had been made gentle, but because the thing being serene was large enough that the world's difficulty barely registered. It was a city built to make the divine feel inevitable and the human feel contingent, and it accomplished this with complete architectural conviction. Gwyn's family filled Anor Londo. There was Guinevere, his daughter, whose presence radiated warmth and comfort, who was beloved by the gods and by the few humans who were permitted to come close enough to feel her influence. She had left Anor Londo before the events of the Great Journey, had gone somewhere safer, somewhere beyond the reach of what the kingdom had become. And what remained in the throne room was Gwyndolin's most complex and loving illusion, an image of his sister so complete and so warm that those who encountered it had no reason to doubt. Guinevere's illusion was enormous, seated on a bed of cloudlight, her hair the red gold of sunset, her manner that of someone who had always known the world was going to be all right, and saw no reason to revise that assessment. She gave the Lord Vessel not as a goddess dispensing a sacred object, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help. And the warmth of that wanting was real enough, because Gwendolyn had put real love into the illusion, love for a sister who was no longer there to express it toward. There was Gwendolyn himself, present but unseen, for most of the journey through Anor Londo, working his moonlight sorceries from the deeper sanctums of the cathedral, maintaining the sun that rose each morning over the city's cliffs, with the disciplined effort of someone who understood that the illusion was the thing holding everything together, and who would not allow it to collapse through inattention. He was Gwyn's youngest son, raised in the tradition of the moon and the dark, because he had been born with qualities that the god of sunlight found difficult to reconcile with his golden ideals, and had been given the moon as a kind of consolation prize that was actually a genuine gift, because the moon offered things the sun did not: subtlety, patience, the power of reflection, and of things that endure by not insisting on their own brightness. He was powerful and private, and devoted to his father's memory, with an intensity that made him one of the most genuinely faithful figures in the kingdom, even if what he was faithful to was a ghost. There was the god of war, Ornstein, great and golden, who commanded the Dragon Slayer Knights and served as one of the most formidable defenders of Anor Londo's gates. He had hunted dragons at Gwyn's side during the Great War, and the glory of that hunt had settled into him the way that formative experiences settle into people, becoming not just memory but architecture, the thing that every subsequent action was built on. He wore gold because gold was what light looked like, solidified. He moved with the precision of someone who had learned exactly what his body could do, and had learned it against opponents who would not accept anything less than perfection. He was one of the 4 great knights of Gwyn's court, the named and legendary figures whose identities had become inseparable from their functions. Ornstein was the dragon slayer the way that fire is warmth, not as a description, but as a definition. And there was Smul, who was something other than noble, something the other gods found distasteful, but tolerated because he was useful, and because some tasks require someone willing to do what the noble-minded will not. Smaug was an executioner by inclination as much as by appointment, a being of enormous physical force and limited concern for the distinctions that more refined beings maintained between acceptable and unacceptable means. He had wanted to be one of Gwyn's great knights and had been refused, had been told, in whatever form that refusal took, that he was not the kind of thing that Gwyn wanted, representing his personal guard, which was an assessment that contained truth even if its application was harsh. Smaug's response to the refusal had been to remain anyway, to do his work in the place he had chosen, with the thoroughness that no one who valued decorum would match, and to be there at the end when almost everyone else had gone, because Smaug was nothing if not persistent. The humans, the descendants of the furtive pygmy, the bearers of the tiny fragments of the dark soul that had been distributed among countless individuals, lived in the lower reaches of the kingdom, in Lordran, in the settlements and cities that clustered in the shadow of Anor Londo's cliffs. They were not slaves, not precisely, but they were not equal to the gods either, and the structure of the world they lived in reflected that distinction in every stone and every law. It was in this context that the dark sign was first considered, first theorized, first feared. The dark soul that the furtive pygmy had carried was different from the Lord's souls. It was not a single great burning thing, but something that had divided and divided again, spreading through the human population like an inheritance, a tiny ember of darkness at the heart of every human being. The gods, who had built their kingdom on the power of fire and light, were not entirely comfortable with the implications of that darkness. They studied it, they worried about it. They built their theology around the fire because the fire was what they understood, and they tried to ensure that the fire would last forever, because if the fire lasted forever, the darkness could never gather enough to matter. The problem was that the fire was already beginning to fade. The first flame was not a permanent thing. It was a great burning, and like all burnings, it consumed itself as it burned. The scholars and priests of Anor Londo, who attended to it, could feel it diminishing over the centuries, the warmth growing slightly less warm, the light slightly less bright, in ways too subtle for any individual to perceive but obvious across the span of generations. The gods had built everything on the assumption that the flame would last, and now they were beginning to understand that it might not. Gwyn had a solution. He was not willing to watch the flame die. He was not willing to watch the Age of Fire end. And so he made decisions, one after another, that were designed to sustain what could not naturally be sustained. And each of those decisions left a mark on the world that would not fade even when everything else did. Long before the flame became critical, long before the crisis that would define the end of Gwyn's age, the kingdom of Lordran settled into something like peace. The great war against the dragons was a memory, a founding myth, a story that priests told and knights commemorated in ritual. The humans in their settlements built their lives around the warmth of the diminishing flame, around the protection of the gods above, around the rhythms of trade and agriculture and death that defined human experience everywhere and always. It was not a perfect world. The world had never been perfect, but it was a world with a shape, with rules, with a structure that told people where they stood and what they could expect. And within that world, even the less visited corners had their character and their history. The city of New Londo stood carved into the cliffs, elegant and strange, its architecture defying what stone should naturally permit, because the four kings who ruled it had taken their fragment of Gwyn's Lord's soul and used it to see deeply into things, to understand structures and forces in ways that their power made possible. New Londo was a city of refinement, of a civilization that had taken the best gifts of the Age of Fire and made something genuinely beautiful from them. Farther south, in the deep, warm reaches that the Witch of Izalith had claimed, the city of Izalith rose around a great bed of fire moss and volcanic warmth. The witch and her daughters worked their pyromancies there, shaping fire into forms that could be taught and shared, developing a tradition of flame working that was distinct from Gwyn's sunlight sorceries, but equally sophisticated. Izalith was alive with the smell of warm earth and the low hum of fires tended with expertise. And in the earth below all of this, in the deepest tomb that could be reached, Nito had made his home. The tomb of the giants was vast and lightless, a place of bones and the quiet work of mortality. Nito presided over it with the patience that death always has, unlimited, unhurried, indifferent to the urgencies that drove the living. For a long time, this was enough. The world turned. The humans lived and died. The gods maintained their distances and their privileges. The first flame dimmed so slowly that no single generation could truly witness it. And then the Witch of Izalith made her attempt. No one has ever been entirely certain what drove her to it. The accounts are old and filtered through the distortions of catastrophe, and the motivations of the witch herself were never clearly recorded, because the witch herself did not survive the attempt in any form that could explain it. But the shape of what she did can be reconstructed from what it left behind. The first flame was fading. The Witch of Izalith understood fire, perhaps better than anyone in the world, and she believed, genuinely and not without reason, that she might be able to create a new first flame. She had a Lord soul of enormous power. She had a lifetime of study in the nature of fire and creation. And she had the ambition that comes from watching something you love beginning to end and refusing to accept that ending. She attempted to replicate the first flame, using her own Lord soul as the seed. What she created was the bed of chaos. It is difficult to describe the bed of chaos because it is difficult to describe something that should not exist. Something that is the product of a process going catastrophically wrong at every level simultaneously. It was fire that had become something else. Something that fire was never meant to be. Not warmth and light and the division of opposites, but raw chaos, unformed and uncontrollable, generating life in the way that rot generates life, endlessly and without purpose. The chaos flame that erupted from the failed creation was not a flame in any meaningful sense. It was an absence of structure where structure had tried to form. The bed of chaos consumed Izalith from within. The witch herself was drawn into it, becoming part of the chaotic core, no longer recognizably herself, no longer anything coherent. Her daughters were changed, most of them becoming daughters of chaos, twisted by the influence of the thing their mother had made, their forms altered, their natures pulled in directions that life was not meant to go. One of them, Quilana, fled. She made it out of Izalith before the transformation could fully take her, and she spent the ages that followed hiding in the swamps above the ruins, teaching pyromancy to any who found her, carrying the knowledge of fireworking that Izalith had developed into a world that no longer had Izalith to preserve it. The creatures that came from the bed of chaos were called the demons. They were not evil in the intentional sense. They had not chosen to be what they were, but they were dangerous in the way that fire without a hearth is dangerous, burning and spreading without regard for what they burned or where they spread. The demon fire sage, the centipede demon, the ceaseless discharge, vast and terrible creatures born from chaos, haunting the ruins of what Izalith had been, unable to understand what they were or what had made them. Gwyn responded to the catastrophe in Izalith the way he responded to all catastrophes, with force and then with containment. His armies could not destroy what the chaos flame had created, but they could prevent it from spreading. The deep southern reaches of the kingdom, the places where Izalith had been and where the demons now roamed, were sealed. Lost Izalith, they called it in the records, though the name itself was a kind of minimization of the reality. It was not merely lost. It was transformed into something that the rest of the kingdom could not afford to look at too closely. The Witch of Izalith had tried to save the first flame and had created something worse than its absence. This was the first great lesson of the Age of Fire, though it came too late to be of use to the one who most needed to learn it. Gwyn drew the lesson differently than it might have been drawn. He did not conclude that some things should be allowed to end naturally. He concluded that the attempt to preserve the flame needed to be made more carefully, more powerfully, with more to invest in the preservation than even the Witch of Izalith had possessed. He decided to sacrifice himself. The first flame was fading, and Gwyn understood that a flame could be sustained by feeding it, the way a hearth fire can be kept alive by adding wood, the way a candle flame leaps when you press another candle to it. He had the greatest Lord soul in the world. He had the power of the sun itself, and if he walked into the kiln where the first flame burned and linked himself to it, if he gave himself to the fire completely, then the Age of Fire would continue. It would not continue forever. He was powerful, but not infinite. What he offered to the flame was not a permanent solution, but a prolonging, a deferral, a buying of time. But time was what he valued, and he was willing to pay any price for it, even his own coherence. Before he went to the kiln, he made arrangements. He scattered his Lord's soul into covenants and fragments, distributing pieces of his power through the mechanisms of the kingdom so that what he was would persist in some form even after what he was had been consumed. He established the dark sign, the mark of the undead, as the defining crisis of the coming age, the thing that would need to be managed, because he understood that as the flame faded, the hollowing of humans would become the great problem of whatever came after him. Humans who died without a sufficient soul to sustain them would not stay dead. They would rise as hollow shells, empty of whatever made them human, walking but not living, accumulating in the places they had died. A growing tide of purposelessness that could overwhelm everything if it was not checked. He left Gwyndolin in Anor Londo to maintain the illusions. He left the Silver Knights and the great defense of the city intact, at least in form. He ensured that the cathedral would continue to receive pilgrims, that the firekeeper at Firelink Shrine would maintain the bonfire that served as the returning point for those who wandered the dangerous reaches of the kingdom, that the systems he had built would continue to function through whatever came next. He also did something that he never explained to anyone, and that the records never fully describe. He made the world into something like a trap or a test, or a machine for producing chosen undead. The kingdom of Lordran was arranged, geographically and historically, in a way that required exactly the kind of undead that the prophecy described. To reach the kiln, you needed the Lord's souls. To gather the Lord's souls, you needed to defeat Nito and the Witch's remnant and the Four Kings and Seath. To reach those encounters, you needed to ring the bells and claim the Lord Vessel. To ring the bells, you needed to survive Undeadburg and Blighttown. To survive Undeadburg and Blighttown, you needed to persist through dying and returning until the dying and returning had taught you everything that Lordran had to teach. The kingdom was, in other words, a school, and the curriculum was the kingdom itself, and the graduation was the kiln of the first flame. And Gwyn had built all of it, whether he intended to or not, simply by being someone who needed a very specific kind of replacement. The dark sign was the mechanism. It guaranteed that the undead who persisted would be the ones who returned again and again, losing a little each time, but keeping enough. Enough soul, enough fire, enough of the original self to continue. The ones who hollowed completely were the ones who had not enough of whatever the fire required. The ones who kept returning were the ones who did. It was not fair in the way that the designs of gods are generally not fair, but it was functional in the way that the designs of gods that last for centuries must be. And then, accompanied by his knights, he walked to the kiln of the first flame, and he linked his fire to the fire that was fading, and he burned. What was left of him was not death exactly. It was something worse and more specific. He became what the ancient stories call a cinder, a thing that had been fully alive and fully powerful, and had burned all of that away in service of the fire, leaving behind a shell that still moved, still reached, still fought with the reflexes of what it had been, but that was hollow at its center in a way that no soul could fill. He was still there, in the kiln, surrounded by the embers of what had been the first flame, guarding it the way a husk of wood guards the coal at its heart. Not because he chose to guard it, but because he had nothing left but the motion of guardianship. The age of fire continued after a fashion. The flame burned, low and unsteady, sustained by what Gwyn had given it. The world went on, but it was changed. Everything was changed in ways that would only become fully visible slowly. The spreading of the dark sign began not with a single event, but with a gradual accumulation of instances, each one troubling on its own, collectively terrifying. A farmer in the lower reaches of Lordran died and did not stay dead. A soldier in New Lundo lost the thread of himself and became something without purpose, wandering the walls. An old priest at Firelink Shrine watched her congregation diminish as the marked ones were taken away, and she was left alone at the bonfire with the fire and her memories. The dark sign appeared as a mark on the skin, a ring of dark against pale flesh, like an eye that had closed and would not open again. Those who bore it were called the undead, and the response of the kingdom's remaining authority was to gather them in and confine them, because the alternative, watching them hollow, watching them become the shambling, purposeless things that hollowing made of people, was a catastrophe that could not be contained if it was allowed to spread. The undead asylum was built for this purpose. It was a massive structure of rough stone, set in a place apart from the rest of the kingdom, a holding facility for those who had been marked, those who might hollow, those whose presence in ordinary society was too dangerous or too distressing to permit. It was not a place of cruelty exactly. Its architects and overseers did not intend it as punishment, but it was a place of confinement, and confinement inflicted its own kind of damage regardless of intention. The knights of the asylum kept order. The pardoners who visited from Oswald of Karim brought their absolutions and their small spiritual comforts, and the imprisoned undead who had not yet hollowed sat in their cells or walked the yard and tried to hold on to the thread of themselves, knowing that each death they suffered would take a little more of that thread, knowing that the end of hollowing was the end of being anyone at all. The legend of the chosen undead began here, in the belief that among the thousands of marked souls in the asylums and the wandering roads of the kingdom, one would be different. One would carry enough of the old fire within them to make it to the kiln, to link their own flame to what remained of the first flame. to extend the Age of Fire once more. The prophecy was not entirely a prophecy. It was partly a hope, shaped into the language of prophecy by those who needed it to be true. Oscar, a knight of Astora, believed in the prophecy. He had been imprisoned in the undead asylum himself, though he was not yet hollow, and he had made it his mission to find the chosen undead and give them the means to escape. He was dying when he did it, reduced by the falling of a corpse and the crushing weight of a gate, broken in ways that would only conclude one way. But he dropped an Estus flask and an old key through a barred opening and told what he knew to whoever was in the cell below. The Estus flask contained the residual warmth of a firekeeper soul, the most nourishing thing an undead could carry, capable of restoring the sense of fire within them that was the undead's substitute for the living warmth they had lost. The key opened the cell, and the undead in that cell, unnamed because the story does not name them, because the story suggests that the name does not matter as much as the choosing, climbed out of their confinement and began to move through the asylum toward whatever the world outside would offer. The asylum itself was a kind of compressed history of everything wrong with the Age of Fire's ending. The cells held the desperate and the lost. The courtyards echoed with the sounds of undead who had already hollowed, who moved in the directionless patterns of things that had forgotten what purpose was. And at the gate that led out of the asylum's deepest chamber, there was an asylum demon, one of the creatures born from the chaos flame of Izalith, or a descendant of such creatures, vast and fleshy, and swinging a great weapon with the mindless aggression of something that had never been given a reason to stop. The undead who had climbed from the cell was not yet a warrior in any meaningful sense. The equipment available was minimal. The demon was enormous. The encounter required either ingenuity or retreat, and retreat, in this case, meant finding another way, climbing the walls of the chamber, finding a route around and above, and falling on the demon from a height with whatever weapon could be salvaged from the guards who had already fallen. The demon fell. It was not a graceful defeat, and it was not clean, but it was a defeat, and in a world where the undead curse was unmaking everyone, a defeat of anything was a kind of miracle. Oscar was at the gate when the undead passed through. He was finishing in the way that people finish when the body has decided regardless of the will. He gave the last of what he knew. Go to Lordran, ring the bells of awakening. There are two of them, one in the church at Undead Burg and one deep in the earth at the base of the valley. Ring them both, and the way will open to Anor Londo. He was not certain what would be there. He was not certain the prophecy was true, but he needed it to be true, and he told it as if it were, and then he was gone. The undead stepped out of the asylum and onto a path that led down the cliff face, and a great bird, a creature of old covenant, a snuggly, or perhaps the same great bird that had served the kingdom for as long as anyone could remember, swept down and carried them south toward Lordran, toward the ruins of Gwyn's kingdom, toward the beginning of the road that Oscar had named. Firelink Shrine was the first significant stop in that journey, and it was a place that had once been a center of warmth and service, and was now something quieter and more complicated. The bonfire that burned at its heart was tended by Anastasia of Astora, a firekeeper whose tongue had been taken. The silence enforced on her was part of the strange theology that had evolved around firekeepers, the sense that their power was too significant to be permitted the additional force of speech. She knelt by the fire and tended it, and communicated what she could through gesture and the warmth of the Estus flasks she enhanced. But she could not speak of what she knew, and what she knew in that ruin was significant. She had been there at the base of the shrine in her hollow below the bonfire, for long enough that the moss had grown over the stone around her, and the water from the aqueduct above had worn channels in the rock beside her, and she had remained simply present and tending, watching the fire the way that devoted things watch what they are devoted to, without the need for acknowledgement or reciprocation, sustained entirely by the act of care itself. Her silence was not absence. It was a particular kind of presence, the kind that does not require language because it communicates something that language would only diminish. Around the shrine, those who had not fully hollowed had gathered, drawn by the bonfire's warmth, the way that the living have always gathered around fire in the dark. Crestfallen warrior sat at the edge of the bonfire's light, with the posture of someone who had been told a great truth and found it unbearable. He had been to the bells, he knew what was there, and the knowing had taken something from him that the journey itself had not. He had made the full circuit, or some significant portion of it, and had returned to Firelink not as a triumphant chosen undead, but as someone who understood exactly how much the triumph would cost, and had decided that the cost was more than he was willing to pay, which was perhaps the most honest decision anyone in the kingdom had made. He was not cowardly. He was accurate, and accuracy in the face of overwhelming difficulty sometimes looks like giving up, because the accurate thing to do and the giving up thing are, in that moment, identical. Petrus of Thorolund came and went with the contained energy of someone who had agendas of his own. He was a cleric of the Way of White, devoted outwardly to Guinevere and the tradition of divine miracles, devoted inwardly to his own survival in a kingdom that was trying very hard to ensure no one survived it. He had been assigned to escort Rhea of Thorolund and her two companions through the early stages of their pilgrimage, and he had assessed the risk and decided that his continued existence outweighed his obligation to the mission, and he had come back to Firelink without the people he was supposed to protect, carrying the smooth story of those who have decided to make their compromises as invisible as possible. Laurentius of the Great Swamp arrived later, rounder and warmer, and more genuinely hopeful than anyone else at the shrine. A pyromancer who understood fire as friendship rather than power. He had been trapped in a barrel in Blighttown, an indignity he carried with good humor, because good humor was what he had, and it had served him well through worse. And the undead who freed him had given him back his life in the most literal sense, which was the kind of debt that Laurentius took seriously and expressed by being as generously helpful as he could manage. He liked the fire. He liked what the fire did, the way it warmed and illuminated, and the way the art of shaping it could be learned with patience and care. He was what the pyromantic tradition of Izalith had hoped to produce, someone who related to fire with joy. Each of them had been drawn to Lordran by the same constellation of hope and obligation, and each of them had found that the kingdom was harder and stranger than the stories had suggested. The crestfallen warrior had found it so hard and so strange that it had unmade his ability to try. The others were still finding their way through it, and the undead from the asylum arrived among them and chose, as the unchosen always must, to be the chosen one anyway. Undead Burg was the first great obstacle, not because it was the most dangerous place in Lordran, but because it was the most immediate demonstration of what the curse had done to ordinary life. The Burg had been a settlement once, a place of merchants and soldiers, and the unremarkable rhythms of community. Now it was a series of bridges and rooftops inhabited by undead soldiers who had hollowed and lost everything but the aggression that Hollow left behind, by the creatures that had moved in when the humans could no longer hold the space, by the occasional survivor who had barricaded themselves in small rooms and guarded small fires with the vigilance of those who understood exactly what it would mean to lose them. Solaire of Astora was there, sitting on a wall with the sun above him and a warmth in his manner that made him immediately distinct from everything else in the burg. He had come to Lordran seeking his own son, not Gwyn's son, not the son that the gods had claimed, but something he described as his very own son, something personal and impossible and glorious in the way that impossible things are glorious when the person pursuing them is genuinely joyful about the pursuit. He was a knight of considerable skill and absolutely no cynicism whatsoever, and in a world that had been generating cynicism at an extraordinary rate, he was remarkable simply by being what he was. He offered cooperation, not service, not submission, but genuine partnership, the kind that asked for nothing and gave freely. He wore his armor with the sun embossed on the chest as if the sun were a personal emblem rather than a divine symbol, which in a sense it was. He had taken something that Gwyn's kingdom claimed as its property and made it his own by approaching it with honesty and delight rather than reverence. The sun he sought was not the son of the gods. It was something he had decided to make his own through the quality of his attention to it, and there was a kind of philosophy in that decision that was both simple and deeply difficult to achieve. He offered to help if the undead left a summon sign, if the call went out through the old covenant magic that allowed souls to reach across the barrier of individual experience and come to the aid of those facing things too large to face alone. He would come shining and grateful, glad for the opportunity to be of use. And then he went back to looking at the sun, because it was his sun and it was worth looking at. Merchant hag Mildred could sometimes be found in the swamps above Blighttown, a half-mad seller of goods who had settled somewhere between commerce and chaos, offering her wares with the urgency of someone for whom each sale might be the last before things got worse. She was not sympathetic in the conventional sense. She would attack if she felt threatened, and her sense of threat was broader than most. But she was alive in a place where most things were hollow, which was its own kind of achievement, and her presence gave the lower reaches of Undead Burg its particular quality, the sense that survival here was possible, but barely, and that bare possibility was what everyone was working with. The undead church crouched above the burg, reachable through a series of narrow passages and guarded bridges, and at the top of its tower, the first bell of awakening hung in the dark. The church had been a place of worship once, of the gods, of the Way of White, of the broader theological tradition that the Age of Fire had developed around its divine patrons. The pews were intact, and the stone of the nave was carved with the symbols of that tradition, the sun and the fire and the outstretched hands of supplication. But the congregation was hollow, and the priest who tended what remained of the altar was the twisted cleric Griggs of Vinheim, trapped in a room without the key to leave it, a sorcerer of the scholarly tradition who had come to Lordran seeking knowledge and found himself imprisoned by circumstances he had not prepared for. Griggs was one of many in the burg who had arrived with purpose and found the purpose complicated by the reality of the place. He wanted to study. He wanted access to the sorceries of the archives. He wanted the intellectual tradition of the ancients, and Lordran had it somewhere, but Lordran also had the locked doors and the hollow knights and the gargoyles on the belfry that stood between any scholar and the things worth studying. Freeing him required the right key and the simple decision that his continued existence mattered. And in a world that was not always inclined to make that decision without external encouragement, it was worth making. Below the belfry, gargoyles had taken residence. 2 of them, bronze and ancient, awakened by whoever or whatever had set them to guard the bell, moving with the jerky mechanical aggression of creatures that had been waiting a very long time for something to strike at. They were difficult. The second arrived when the first was half destroyed, adding its flame breath to the combat at the worst possible moment, and the stone of the belfry was scorched and cracked from fires that had been burning there since before the undead from the asylum had arrived. The bell itself had not been rung in so long that when it finally rang, the sound of it was startling in its resonance, deeper and more complex than the size of the bell suggested, as if the sound had been building up in the metal for years and was now releasing everything at once. But the bell rang. It echoed down through the burg and into the valley below, across the water and into the deep places, and something that had been waiting to hear it shifted in the dark. Below Undead Burg, past the base of the valley, where the river ran cold and dark, was Darkroot Garden, a place that remembered more clearly than most what the world had been before the Age of Fire. The trees there had been ancient when Gwyn was young, and they had been growing in the slow grey way of stone trees through all the centuries of the gods' rule. And they had continued growing even as the kingdom frayed and the humans hollowed. The garden remembered the everlasting dragons in the way that old places remember old things, without nostalgia, without judgment, just with the vast and patient permanence of something that had outlasted everything that had tried to change it. Sif, the great grey wolf, guarded a grave in the garden. The grave belonged to Artorius, one of Gwyn's 4 greatest knights, and the story of how Artorius came to be buried there was one of the most significant of all the stories that the Age of Fire had generated, though it was told slantwise in the kingdom, told in the way that stories are told when the telling is too painful to do directly. Artorius had been the knight sent to deal with the Abyss. The Abyss was what had happened to New Lundo, or more precisely, what had happened when the 4 kings lost their way, when the fragments of Gwyn's Lord Soul that they carried became insufficient anchor against the darkness that the Dark Soul, distributed through humanity, could generate in great concentrations. The Abyss was a spreading nothing, a darkness more thorough than the absence of light, something that consumed and emptied whatever it touched. It had risen in New Lundo, and the New Lundo undead had been its first victims, and then its population, becoming dark wraiths who moved through the spreading dark hunting for humanity to bring back to the kings who had fallen into it. Gwyn's response to the Abyss had been Artorius. The knight was paired with a great shield and a great bow and a wolf companion, and he was sent into the corrupted region of Ulakuil, a place adjacent to where the Abyss was spreading, a place of ancient sorcery where the power of the pygmies had been concentrated for generations to contain what could not apparently be stopped. And Artorius fought. He fought magnificently in the way that the greatest knights fight, with skill and will and the total commitment that separates heroes from everyone else. He was overwhelmed. The Abyss was too much for any one being, however powerful. Artorius fell, and in falling, did the last thing he could do. He used his great shield to create a barrier around Sif, protecting his wolf companion from the corruption that was consuming him, sacrificing his own protection to ensure that Sif would survive. The Abyss took Artorius then, not destroying him, but warping him, turning the greatest knight of the age into something twisted and hollow and terrible, still moving with the reflexes of what he had been, but aimed at nothing good. Sif had stayed with the grave, guarding it, carrying the great shield that Artorius had left, waiting in the way that loyal things wait, without understanding the duration or the nature of what they waited for. And when the undead from the asylum came to the grave seeking the ring that would allow passage through the Abyss, because that was also part of Artorius's legacy, the covenant he had made with the creatures of darkness that had given him some limited ability to walk its paths. Sif defended it, because defending it was the only thing left that could be done for the one who was no longer there to be defended. The road to the second bell required going down. Lordran was a kingdom built in depth as much as breadth, and its history was layered in a way that was almost geological. The oldest things were the deepest things, and traveling toward the second bell meant traveling through all the accumulated strata of the Age of Fire's decline. Darkroot Basin gave way to the Valley of the Drakes, a place where the lesser descendants of the everlasting dragons still moved in the water and along the cliff faces, not great enough to be threats to the kingdom, but too persistent to have been removed from it. Below that, the passages opened into Blighttown, and Blighttown was the kingdom's hidden shame made visible and architectural. It had been, once, the lower levels of the great city of Quellana's people, the pyromancers who had continued to work their fire arts in the shadow of what Izalith had been. But proximity to the chaos and the slow seeping of the swamp's corruption had transformed it into something layered and airless and poisonous, a maze of wooden platforms hanging over a dark swamp that breathed disease, inhabited by the broken things that the kingdom had discarded, those too poor, too cursed, too sick to be kept anywhere more visible. The structures holding the platforms had been reinforced again and again, as the platforms below had rotted and the platforms above had been added, creating a precarious hanging architecture of salvage and desperation. It smelled of stagnant water and the peculiar sweetness of decay, and the things that moved through it, the bloated corpses, the witch doctors whose poisoned darts came from the dark, had the quality of things that had adapted to a very specific kind of suffering. At the bottom of Blighttown, the swamp itself stretched in low fog and ankle-deep corrupted water to where the second bell of awakening sat in a tower at the swamp's edge. Quellag guarded it. She was a daughter of the Witch of Izalith, one of those who had been transformed when her mother reached into chaos, her lower body fused with a great white spider form, her upper body still recognizably human and desperately sad with the weight of what had happened to her. She had a sister in the swamp, another daughter of the witch, more deeply corrupted, barely coherent, the center of a covenant of those who sought to use Chaos's fire for something approaching human purpose. And Quellag was hunting for humanity to bring to her sister, who could use it to hold together just a little longer. She was not a monster in the way that monsters are imagined, not purposeless or malicious. She was someone trying to help someone she loved with the only resources available to her, which happened to be venom and flames and the nightmare of her physical form. She was, in other words, a victim of her circumstances who had made her circumstances into something she could act within, which was the best that could be said of most people in the world of Lordran. The undead fought her, and the bell rang, and the second echo joined the first, and somewhere far above in Anor Londo, something changed. Sen's fortress stood between the valley floor and the cliff face that bore Anor Londo, and it was a test in the most architectural sense, a place that had been designed to break the inadequate, that existed specifically to ensure that whoever reached Anor Londo had earned the reaching. It was ancient, built in the time when Gwyn still sat on his throne, and pilgrims still made the journey, and it had been doing its work of selecting and discarding for so long that the mechanisms of its cruelty were almost beautiful in their precision, swinging blades in corridors too narrow to simply avoid, rolling boulders that required exact timing to survive, lightning traps that connected to the great snake-like titanite demons who lived in the fortress's depths and who could be appeased or fought depending on what approach the traveler took, and at the fortress's exterior, on ledges so narrow that the wind from the cliff face was a constant adversary, the iron golem who guarded the final passage, a construct of immense size that swung its great axe with mechanical patience, that barely noticed the human-sized figure trying to find its way past it. The iron golem fell, and the great bird returned, and the clouds parted as the bird swept upward through them, and suddenly the grey of the valley was behind and below, and ahead was the gold. Anor Londo was staggering, even diminished, even maintained by illusion and the hollow devotion of gods who had long since left or faded. It was staggering. The silver buttresses, the painted windows, the scale of halls so vast that the figures moving through them at ground level were reduced to footnotes. The painted world that lay inside one of those windows was a world unto itself, a place where an ancient being called Priscilla had been contained because she was something that the gods had made or found and not entirely known what to do with. A crossbreed of human and dragon, gentle and isolated and capable of making herself invisible to those who had not come in kindness. The great hall that led to the inner sanctum of Anor Londo was guarded by Ornstein and Small. They were the last defense, or the last obvious defense, and they were nearly impossible in the way that great and terrible partnerships are nearly impossible. Ornstein's speed and lightning against Smaug's mass and persistence, two completely different fighting philosophies that complemented each other almost perfectly. Ornstein, the Golden Dragon Slayer, moved like light moves, fast and aimed. Smaug, who was not beloved and knew it, moved like something that had decided the best response to not being loved was to make sure the unloved feeling was mutual. And when one of them fell, the other absorbed them. Whichever survived grew larger, took in something of what the other had been, and became a final challenge that was a fusion of both. Both philosophies in one great form, both terrors in one impossible encounter. But they fell. All things fell. That was what the undead curse had, unintentionally, taught the world. That enough persistence, enough returning, enough willingness to fail again and again, and learn something from each failure, eventually accumulated into something sufficient to go forward. Guinevere waited at the end of the Great Hall, or rather, an image of Guinevere waited there, enormous, radiant, warm, with a light that seemed to come from within and illuminate everything around her with the soft gold of a late afternoon in summer. She welcomed the undead with a calm that was entirely appropriate to a daughter of the Lord of Sunlight, and she gave them the Lord Vessel, a great bowl of ancient gold that Gwyn had left, that had been waiting for the chosen undead, that could be used to warp between the bonfires of the kingdom and to unlock the passage to the kiln of the first flame, where Gwyn's cinder still burned. She was an illusion. It was Gwyndolin's illusion, maintained in the same way that Gwendolyn maintained the sun that still rose over Anor Londo. Not because the sun was real, not because Guinevere still sat in that hall, but because Anor Londo, without its goddess and without its sun, was a truth too desolate for the purpose Gwendolyn was trying to serve. The purpose was to keep the system running, to keep the chosen undead believing that there was a system worth running toward, to maintain the architecture of hope that the prophecy required. Because if the prophecy collapsed, if the chosen undead stopped choosing, then the only remaining option was the end of the Age of Fire and the beginning of something no one in the kingdom was prepared to face. Carter, the primordial serpent, was prepared to face it. There were two primordial serpents, Frampt and Carthy, and they had been part of the world for longer than almost anything else in it. Ancient beings who claimed to serve the chosen undead's best interests, while serving agendas so layered and so long-running that it was genuinely difficult to determine where the service ended and the manipulation began. Frampt slept at Firelink Shrine, enormous and sinuous and ancient, and he guided the chosen undead toward linking the fire, toward doing what Gwyn had done, toward keeping the cycle going. He spoke of it with the warmth of genuine belief, or at least with the warmth of something that had decided belief was the most useful posture. Carthy was different. Carthy waited in the abyss beneath New Londo, in the darkness that had swallowed the Four Kings, and he told a different story. He said that the Age of Fire was a mistake, or rather that the prolonging of the Age of Fire was a mistake, that the Age of Dark that would follow was not a catastrophe, but a natural transition, that the humans, the bearers of the Dark Soul, were the rightful inheritors of the world, and had been kept from their inheritance by Gwyn's desperate and selfish act of linking his fire to the First Flame. Carthy offered to lead the chosen undead to the Dark Lord ending, to let the fire die, to let the darkness gather, to begin what he called the Age of Dark. He also told the truth about what had happened to the Four Kings. They had fallen not through any weakness of their own, but because Cardi himself had offered them the same choice he was offering now, and they had taken it, and what the abyss did to those who took it was what was waiting in New Londo as the most terrible demonstration of what the Age of Dark actually looked like, up close, without the rhetoric. The chosen undead had to decide. It was, perhaps, the most significant decision in the world at that moment, not because one path was clearly better than the other, but because both paths had been presented with conviction, and neither had been presented with complete honesty, and the choosing had to happen anyway. New Londo ruins lay flooded below Firelink Shrine, the water that had been released to contain the abyss still filling the lower passages decades after the flooding. The dark wraiths who had been sealed inside still moving through the dark water, with the aggressive emptiness of things that had been cut off from everything except the drive to hunt. The Four Kings waited at the bottom, past the flooded stairways and the ghosts of the city's former inhabitants, who could not be harmed by ordinary weapons, who existed in a phase of reality slightly different from the one the living moved through. They were still kings. That was what the abyss had preserved, not their wisdom or their virtue or the civilization they had built, but the authority, the power, the raw force that Gwyn's fragment of Lord's soul had given them. They moved in the dark like shadows of what royalty had been, enormous and cold and consuming, each one summoning the others as they were defeated, so that the fight never truly ended until it was genuinely over. When they finally fell, something shifted in the dark beneath them. The abyss did not vanish. It had spread too far and too deep for any single defeat to undo, but the concentrated heart of it, the Four Kings themselves, was gone, and in the ringing silence that followed, Carty appeared to offer his covenant and his alternative story of what the ending of the Age of Fire could mean. The catacombs offered the same mixture of history and horror. Below the cemetery at the base of Firelink Shrine, the burial warrens extended deeper and deeper into the earth, and the skeletons in them were not at rest. Nito's dominion over the dead extended to reanimating them endlessly, the way that the Earth's gravity endlessly draws things down. Pinwheel had stolen something from Nito, masks of the father and mother and child representing different aspects of mortality, and had made his home in the catacombs with what he'd taken, becoming a strange and pitiable figure of divided self, using stolen power to maintain a self that could not sustain itself without theft. Past Pinwheel, past the catacombs, past the passages that required jumping into what appeared to be nothing, and was actually the edge of the tomb of the giants. The deepest place in Lordran opened into lightless vastness. The tomb of the giants was so dark that only a specific skull lantern, carved from the skull of a dead giant, could illuminate the narrow passages that wound between the enormous bones of creatures whose scale made the size of the world feel suddenly different. Patches the hyena waited in the dark there, a recurring figure throughout the kingdom, a man of flexible morality and complete survival instinct who would kick travelers into pits and then sell them rope ladders, who existed in the world as a reminder that not everyone in a dying kingdom was there for heroic reasons. Nito was at the bottom of everything. He was exactly what he had always been, vast and skeletal, and wrapped in the burial shroud that was his nature, moving slowly in the absolute dark of the deepest tomb, lord of a domain that required no maintenance, because death requires no maintenance. His Gravelord's sword dance sent the bones of the dead radiating outward in waves that could shatter stone. The Gravelord greatsword descended in arcs too wide and too fast for the space to prepare for. He fought the way death fights, without urgency, without the sense that losing was possible, because death does not lose. Death simply waits. He fell too. The undead, accumulating the pattern of defeating what should not be defeatable, sent even Nito down among the dead he presided over, and took the Lord's soul he carried and added it to the collection that the Lord vessel was accumulating. The final Lord's soul remained in the chaos below Izalith. The passage through demon ruins required navigating what the Witch of Izalith's catastrophe had left. The ruins of the city under a sky of fire orange. The demons who had been born from the bed of chaos moving through the rubble, with the heavy indifference of things that had never been given a reason to care about anything. The fire sage demon, vast and flamy, guarded passages. The centipede demon, a mass of limbs and chitin and desperate violence, occupied the lava-edged channel that separated the ruins from what lay beneath. Lost Izalith was below all of it, deeper even than the ruins, a place that had become so thoroughly permeated by the chaos fire that the ground itself was alive in uncomfortable ways, that the root structures of the bed of chaos penetrated the soil in all directions, that walking through it was like walking through something's body. The daughters of chaos who had not escaped and had not fully transformed maintained a silent and terrible vigil in the deep chambers, their forms suggesting the outlines of what they had been, while containing something they had not intended to become. The bed of chaos itself was the most genuinely tragic of all the Lord's soul encounters, because what had to be defeated was not a villain and not a monster, but a mistake. The thing that had been the Witch of Izalith still existed somewhere inside the chaos fire, still constituted the heart of it, still dimly animated the burning root web that lashed out at anything that came close. To claim the Lord's soul required reaching the heart of the bed of chaos and destroying the root structure that maintained it, which meant destroying what remained of the witch herself. There was no negotiating with it. There was no mercy in the situation. There was only the terrible clarity of what the attempt to save something had produced, and the equally terrible clarity that dealing with it required ending it. When the bed of chaos collapsed, the region quieted, not healed, not restored, but quieted in the way that a wound quiets when the infection is finally drawn out. The warmth of what the witch had meant persisted in the ruins, in the memory of what Izalith had been before she reached for too much. The kiln of the first flame was reached by descent and then by a warping through the Lord vessel that placed the undead at the entrance to the oldest place in the kingdom. It had not always been the oldest place. When Gwyn built his kingdom, the kiln was relatively new, a structure built to house and honor the first flame. But time had done to it what time does to everything left unattended. which is to clarify it down to essentials, to strip away the decorative until only the structural remained. The path to Gwyn was through his former knights. Silver Knights still stood guard, or the remnants of Silver Knights. Those who had stayed at their posts through everything, who had outlasted the purpose the posts were meant to serve, who had kept to the positions Gwyn had assigned them with the loyalty that cannot distinguish between service and pointlessness, because it was never given the capacity to make that distinction. They were tragic in the specific way that duty is tragic when it outlasts the conditions that made the duty meaningful. And then there was Gwyn. He was sitting at the edge of what remained of the first flame, a small and faltering light in an enormous darkness, with his head bowed and his posture carrying the weight of everything he had given to maintain it. He was a cinder, which is to say he was the shape of what he had been without the substance, the outline of a god without any of the content that makes a god other than just a powerful being. He rose when the undead entered, and he attacked with the reflexes that the Silver Knights had spent centuries developing, and he was very fast and very powerful and completely empty inside. The fight with Gwyn was not a fight against evil. It was not a fight against malice or ambition or any of the human failings that usually motivate the great conflicts of great stories. It was a fight against desperation, against the last act of a being who had sacrificed everything to preserve something that could not be preserved, whose sacrifice had bought time but not resolution, who had become a guardian of embers too small to warm anything, and too proud or too hollow to admit it. He fell like everything else had fallen, and the embers of the first flame dimmed around where he lay, and the undead stood in the kiln with the Lord's souls they had gathered and the choice they had carried all the way from the asylum. Link the fire, take what Gwyn had done and do it again. Walk into the fading flame, give yourself to it, become the next great fuel for an age that was not yet willing to end. The cycle would continue. The age of fire would persist, sustained by another sacrifice, dimming again over centuries until another chosen undead made the journey and faced the same choice at the same kiln. Or let it fade. Step back from the fire. Refuse the sacrifice. Allow what could not be sustained to finally stop being sustained. The Age of Dark would begin, and what the Age of Dark meant, truly, in the long span of things, was not yet written, because it had not yet happened. Neither ending was without cost. Neither ending was simple. The choice was the story's refusal to offer resolution, its insistence on telling the truth about the shape of great decisions, which is that they are almost never between something good and something bad, but between something bad and something differently bad, between a known suffering and an unknown one. And the fire went in whatever direction the one who stood before it chose. But the story does not end at the kiln, even if the immediate narrative concludes there. What the journey through Lordran had revealed, what the accumulated fragments of history gathered from inscriptions and conversations, and the things found in the dark places of the kingdom had suggested, was a picture of a world that had been running on borrowed time for so long that it had forgotten what original time looked like. The dragons had been defeated by betrayal and given the world over to the gods. The gods had built their civilization on the power of a flame they had not made and could not maintain. The Witch of Izalith had tried to replace what was fading and had created chaos in its place. Gwyn had tried to sustain what was fading and had burned himself away to do it. The humans, the bearers of the dark soul, the true inheritors of a world that had never officially been theirs, had been cursed with the dark sign and locked in asylums and sent on quests that served other people's visions of what the world should be. Solaire of Astora had wandered the kingdom looking for his own son, which was, in its way, the most honest thing that anyone in Lordran was doing, looking for something personal and luminous in a world that had made all the large luminous things into instruments of someone else's policy. Whether he found it depended on choices made in the depths of lost Izalith, where the sunlight maggot waited to occupy him if he reached that far without being protected by the right covenant, the right preparation, the right kind of care from those who had walked alongside him. If the preparation was right, if the care had been taken, Solaire stood at the kiln's entrance in his golden armor and his radiant gratitude, having found something he could not name but could feel, ready to fight at the side of the one he had befriended with such uncomplicated generosity. Siegmeyer of Katarina had wandered with a cheerful stubbornness that was its own kind of heroism, consistently stuck in positions that required outside help, consistently grateful for the help when it came, consistently unaware of or unconcerned by the dignity cost of needing to be rescued. His journey was a gentle parallel narrative, a story of a man who was not the chosen undead and not a great warrior, but who was trying anyway for reasons that were not complicated. Somewhere in Ash Lake, if the worst happened, he might find his conclusion in the dark and the water. His daughter Sieglinde watching from a distance with the grief of someone who had come too far to help and not far enough to stop watching. Sieglinde herself was one of the most quietly heartbreaking figures in all of Lordran. A fully human woman, one of the few not bearing the dark sign, who had used an egg of the dragon to become temporarily undead so she could enter the kingdom and find her father, which was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of love. She walked through the kingdom in golden armor, not built for the specific dangers of every area she passed through, looking for one man, sustained by the love that made the seeking worthwhile. Big Hat Logan had arrived seeking the archives. Logan was an ancient and brilliant sorcerer, Big Hat for the enormous hat he wore, which was a kind of eccentric flag for his eccentricity, who had spent his life studying the sorceries of the ancient world, and who understood that the archives of Duke Seath held knowledge that could not be found anywhere else in the world. He sought it with the hunger that genuine scholars have for genuine knowledge, and he found it, and Seath's archives gave it to him, and the knowledge was too large for any mind to hold intact. Logan's journey ended in the archives, his mind finally overwhelmed by the crystalline sorceries he had mastered, wandering the library in a state past hollow, still casting but not knowing why, still brilliant in the mechanical way that brilliant things continue being themselves after the person inside them has gone somewhere the body cannot follow. Seth the Scaleless himself, in his archives, was the most complete portrait of what ambition does when it is given everything it needs, and it still isn't enough. He had his immortality, the fragment of Gwyn's Lord's soul that gave him the crystal scales he had never naturally possessed. He had his archives, vast rooms of accumulated knowledge. He had his research, the crystalline magic that had become his signature, growing toward a form of immortality more complete than even the fragment could provide. He had his duke's status, his formal position in the kingdom's hierarchy, the recognition from Gwyn that his betrayal of the dragons had been worth something. And none of it was enough. He had gone mad in the way that things go mad when they have everything they wanted and discover that the wanting was better than the having, that the hunger that drove them was the only thing that had made them coherent, and its satisfaction had left them without a center. He kept humans in his archives for study. He crystallized them. He conducted experiments that the humans in question had no say in and no understanding of, because they were resources rather than people in Seath's calculus, which was perhaps the truest expression of what he was, a being who had survived by making resources out of beings who deserved better. The lore of the Great Hollow and Ash Lake was something different from all of this. where the rest of Lordran was heavy with the weight of the Age of Fire's decline, with the accumulated grief of gods who had faded and humans who had hollowed, and places that had been great and were no longer. The Great Hollow and what it led to felt like the world's memory of itself before any of that had happened. The Great Hollow was a shaft of enormous scope, descending through the base of Blighttown and through layers of stone beyond what any settlement had reached, lined with branches of a tree so vast that its scale was disorienting, its bark forming ledges and platforms that could be traversed if care was taken, its interior echoing with the sounds of basilisks and other creatures that had retreated into the deep places of the world to avoid whatever was happening above. At the bottom of the Great Hollow, the stone gave way to sand, and the sand was the shore of Ash Lake. The lake was enormous, lit from above by shafts of light that came from somewhere beyond the ceiling of stone, reflecting off water that moved with the patience of deep water everywhere. And in the lake, standing in the shallows of the water, as they had stood in the grey crags before the Age of Fire began, there were everlasting dragons. Not many, a few perhaps, the last survivors of the ancient age, or the ones who had been far enough south and far enough down that even Gwyn's war had not reached them. They stood absolutely still in the water, regarding nothing or regarding everything in the way that very old and very large creatures sometimes do, with a completeness of attention that individual objects cannot contain. The covenant of the path of the dragon could be found here, an agreement that offered the ability to transform, slowly and with dedication, into something approaching what the everlasting dragons had been, not through power, not through combat, but through stillness, through patience, through meditative practice of standing perfectly still in acknowledgement of the dragon's form. It was perhaps the strangest covenant in the kingdom, the one that required the least aggression and the most commitment, the one that asked for nothing external and everything internal. It was possible to simply stand in Ash Lake and watch the dragons stand in the water and let the silence of the oldest place in the world settle around you. And in the context of everything else that Lordran was, the desperate conflicts, the dying gods, the hollow things, the burning choices, the silence of Ash Lake was something close to peace. The painted world of Ariamis lay inside a painted image in Anor Londo, accessible only by holding the appropriate doll and pressing through what had seemed like ordinary pigment and canvas, and was instead a passage into another world entirely. The painted world was a closed ecosystem, its sky heavy with ash and snow, its pathways covered in the white that drifted from above in silence. It was beautiful in the way that isolation is beautiful, completely itself, complete within itself, made of only what it contained and affected only by what it generated. Priscilla lived there, or had been placed there. The accounts disagree on the degree to which her residence was voluntary. She was a crossbreed, dragon and human, or something adjacent to those categories, whose presence had made the gods uncomfortable in the way that things make those in power uncomfortable when they fit no established category. She had been given the painted world as her home, or her containment, and she had made her peace with it in the way that contained things make their peace when the containment is not itself cruel. She could make herself invisible and asked only to be left alone. If the undead who arrived through the painting left without making themselves a threat, she would not prevent the leaving. If they pressed toward conflict, she would fight with the scythe of her tail and the slow drift of her life hunt, which drained not blood but the vital warmth directly. She was not evil. She was not a villain. She was someone who had been placed somewhere, and who had made a life there and who wanted the life she had made to continue without interruption. The things that lived in the painted world alongside her were also refugees of various kinds. The undead who had been sent there or had found their way there. The phalanx creatures who guarded the passages. Crossbreed Priscilla's presence giving the world a center around which everything else organized itself. It was a complete world, the way any sufficiently enclosed place becomes complete, and leaving it by jumping from its cliff edge, the way out when the painting's inherent logic was followed to its conclusion, was a falling that ended in the ordinary stone floors of Anor Londo, which felt ordinary now only in comparison to what had just been left. Quilana of Izalith had found her way to the swamps above the ruins of her home and had been teaching pyromancy there for an indeterminate time. She appeared only to those who had already developed sufficient competency in pyromancy, not as gatekeeping, but as recognition, meeting her students where they were, rather than bringing them to some standard she had arbitrarily determined. She was the last of the Witch of Izalith's daughters who remembered Izalith as it had been, before the bed of chaos, before the transformation of her sisters, before the demons and the heat and the loss of everything familiar. She taught fire with a care that had everything to do with what she had seen fire do when care was not taken, and her pyromancies were precise and generous and profoundly respectful of what fire was capable of being when it was tended properly. She did not speak much of her mother. When she did, there was something in the way she spoke of it that suggested she had made peace with the loss in the way that a person makes peace with something they can do nothing about, not by forgetting it, not by resolving it, but by learning to carry it in a way that did not require putting it down to do other things. Laurentius of the Great Swamp had been trapped in Blighttown by a barrel before the undead from the asylum freed him, and he had come to Firelink Shrine to continue his studies of pyromancy with a warmth and gratitude that was entirely genuine. He was the kind of person who found something to be joyful about in most situations, not through denial of the difficult, but through genuine orientation toward the warm. He liked fire. He thought fire was friendly. He thought pyromancy was one of the best things a person could learn. He was right about all of this in ways that Quilana would have recognized. Laurentius's limit was his desire to improve so much that he might exceed his own capacity to improve safely. If told about Quilana, told in a way that suggested a teacher who could give him what he most wanted, the advanced pyromancies that required a level of understanding beyond what Firelink's bonfire could provide, he would go to her. And if the undead had not been careful about the order of things, if Laurentius found Quilana before he was ready, the lesson might cost him the thread of himself. Quilana's fire was serious. It was not unkind, but it was serious in the way that serious things are. The crystal cave was where Seth had retreated into his final madness, and it was crystalline in a way that the word crystalline cannot adequately convey. Every surface was clear or pale blue or refracting. Every passage was filled with the cold light of crystal that glowed from within. Every step forward required distinguishing between what looked like floor and what was actually a drop into void, because the invisible floor had not yet manifested its visibility. Crystal golems moved through the passages, constructs of Sieth's research, keeping order in a lab that had long since ceased to resemble anything ordered. Seath himself occupied the most crystalline room of all, his scaled body enormous in the space, his tentacle beard making patterns that had no meaning to anyone but possibly himself, his 6 eyes tracking with the fractured attention of a mind that had crystallized around its obsessions, the way the cave had crystallized around him. He was still working. Whatever he was working on was not accessible to ordinary understanding. because his understanding had moved past the place where ordinary understanding could follow. He was magnificent and terrible and profoundly alone with his incomprehensible purpose. The only way to harm him was to first destroy his pale drake stone, the crystal that granted him his immortality, the thing he had worked so hard for and that Gwyn had supplemented with a Lord Soul shard, and that had, in combination with everything else, made him into something that could not be ended by ordinary means. Destroying the stone and then fighting him was the sequence that made the otherwise impossible possible, and it still was not easy, and it still required more of the undead than almost anything else had. And what was found afterward, the fragments of his Lord's soul, the knowledge of his research, the questions that his archives raised about the nature of crystallomancy and the nature of the eyes of death, were worth having, but they were worth having in the way that terrible knowledge is worth having, which is not the same as comfortably. The Way of White, the covenant of Thorolund that Petrus and his companions had represented, had a theology built around fire and the linking of it around the chosen undead and the prophecy around the idea that the age of fire should be sustained because the gods had built something worth sustaining, and the humans who worshipped the gods had staked their entire civilization on the accuracy of that assessment. Petrus had come to escort Rhea of Thorolund, a high-ranking cleric of the Way of White, through the early portions of the journey, and he had abandoned her when the hollowing of her companions had made the mission seem more dangerous than rewarding. Rhea persisted. She had come to Lordran to learn the miracles of the gods, to find the divine blessings that the deepest tombs had preserved, and she went into the catacombs with a faith that was not diminished by what Petrus had done, because faith in that mode is not dependent on the behavior of those who share it. She made it through. She found what she was looking for. She made her way back to Firelink and later to the Duke's archives, still learning, still serving the purpose she had set herself, until Seath's interest in her ended that purpose in the crystalline rooms that ended so many purposes. The miracle system that the Way of White practiced was one thread in the larger tapestry of how the gods had distributed what they were through the structures of the kingdom. The soul arts, sorcery and pyromancy and miracles were all, in their different ways, expressions of what the Lord's souls contained, fragments of the power of the Age of Fire distributed through practices that made that power available to ordinary people in managed amounts. Sorceries were the intellectual tradition of Seath's archives and the lost school of Ulakail. Pyromancies were the practical tradition of Izalith and Quilana's survival of it. Miracles were the devotional tradition of the gods, the power of faith channeled through the relationship between the human and the divine. All three traditions were part of the same story, the story of how power moves through a world, how it changes as it passes through different hands, what it becomes when it is interpreted by different minds for different purposes. Ulasail was a civilization that had existed before the current order of the world, a community of sorcerers who had developed a tradition of magic working with the power of light in ways that were distinct from Gwyn's sunlight sorceries, darker and more personal, more focused on the manipulation of soul itself. It had been destroyed, or rather, it had been driven to destroy itself, by a sequence of events that began with the summoning of something from the abyss. A primordial human, the first of the bearers of the Dark Soul's inheritance, had been buried in Ulasil. His name was Manus, and he had been sleeping in that dark place for as long as the abyss had been spreading. And when he was disturbed, when his grave was broken open by those who thought they could use what was inside it, the darkness in him expanded outward with the force of everything that had been contained for too long. Manus became something vast and dark and powerful, the father of the abyss, a being whose grief at his disturbance had become indistinguishable from rage, whose hands reached through time itself to pull things toward him. He had pulled someone from the undead's own era, someone whose presence in his time caused paradoxes that the world worked to repair by sending the undead back through time to address them. The knight Elizabeth of Unkindled had sent a message through time, had found a way to call for help that crossed the boundary of centuries, and the great bird that served the old covenant had carried the undead to Unkindled's past. What Manus had caused in Unkindled was what the abyss does when it has something to grow toward. It spread through the community, darkening the sorceries, corrupting the people, turning the light magic of Unkindled into dark magic, the personal and soulful into the consuming and dark. The sorcerers of Unkindled became the enemies of everything that had made Unkindled worth visiting. Their magic, once precise and illuminating, became a weapon pointed indiscriminately at whatever was nearest. Artorius had come to Unkindled. This was the Artorius before the grave, before Sif and the Great Shield, before the corruption, and had fought Manus and had fallen, and was now what the abyss made of things it consumed, still moving in the corrupted forest with the terrible competence of a master swordsman who had been given something else to serve. The fight with what Artorius had become was perhaps the most sorrowful fight in all of Lordran's sorrowful history, fighting someone who could not be saved, who could only be ended, and who in ending was in some sense given back the rest that the abyss had denied him. Manus himself, in his deep lair beneath Unkindled, was the abyss given a heart. He was enormous and many-limbed, and his dark soul fragmented when he finally fell, pieces of him scattering into the future to become the daughters of dark, the beings who would carry forward the inheritance of humanity's deepest nature across the ages that followed Lordran's end. He was not evil in the way the word usually means, which is to say, he did not intend harm. He was someone whose sleep had been broken and whose grief had become something that the world could not contain. He was the dark soul's most concentrated expression, not in the glorious sense, not in the sense of human potential fulfilled, but in the sense of what happens when what is most human about humanity is disturbed before it is ready and cannot find its way back to peace. After Manus fell, the past of Unkindled began its long process of becoming the Darkroot Garden, the dark and ancient trees growing over what had been a civilization, the time between what was and what would be doing its quiet work of transformation. And the undead returned to their own era, carrying the knowledge of what the abyss had always been and who had always been at its heart. Darkstalker Carthi had offered his covenant, and some who took it became dark wraiths, those who hunted humanity in the service of the kings who had fallen into the abyss, or in service of Carthi's vision of what the Age of Dark could mean for humankind. The Dark Wraith Covenant was violent and extractive and uncomfortable in all the ways that things are uncomfortable when their methods are honest expressions of the uglier implications of their philosophy. The Forest Covenant offered something different: protection of the graves of the ancient forest, a collective defense against the invaders who came seeking the souls of Lordran's dead. Alvina, the great cat who led the covenant, spoke to those she deemed worthy and offered the agreement with the directness of someone who had been making this offer for a very long time and had no interest in embellishing it. She wanted the forest protected. She wanted Artorius's grave left in peace. She had the loyalty of Shiva of the East and his bodyguard, who would sell weapons to those who joined and helped defend the graves, and the loyalty of the forest itself in a broader sense. the way that old places have loyalty to those who take care of them. Gwyndolin's covenant, the Blades of the Dark Moon, was devoted to punishing the sins of the world, specifically the sins of those who had been judged by the Book of the Guilty and who had accumulated enough judgments to warrant the attention of the Dark Moon Blades. It was a covenant of divine punishment, organized around the last theology of the gods in their diminished state, with Gwendolyn himself as both its figurehead and its most genuine believer. He believed in the system his father had built. He maintained it. He was keeping the faith in the most literal sense, and there was something both admirable and melancholy about his devotion to a divine order that had already mostly dissolved. The princess's guard, devoted to Guinevere, or to the image of Guinevere that Gwendolyn maintained, was a covenant of warmth and healing, of the miracle tradition at its most generous, oriented toward the support of others rather than the advancement of the self. It was perhaps the most immediately kind of the covenants, though it was also built on an illusion, which gave everything connected to it a slightly fragile quality, as if the kindness were real, but the foundation beneath it might not be. There is something in the architecture of Lordran itself that tells the story of what the Age of Fire did to the world and to the people in it. The kingdom was built to be traversed in spirals, the geography looping back on itself so that early areas connected to late areas in unexpected ways, so that the path through was never entirely linear, but always revealed something new, even in familiar spaces when approached from a different direction. It was a world that rewarded patience and punished assumption, that offered its knowledge only to those willing to explore the full circumference of each space, rather than hurrying through to the next objective. The bonfires were the most significant architectural decision of all, the warm points of return in a world that would otherwise be entirely cold. They were not truly safe. Nothing in Lordran was truly safe. But they were warm, and warmth in a world defined by the fading of the first flame was not nothing. It was the closest thing to home that the wandering undead had. Each one lit was a small reclamation of space from the darkness, a temporary declaration that this place, for now, belonged to someone who was trying, rather than someone who had given up. The firekeepers who maintained the bonfires were, in their way, the most important beings in the kingdom. Not the most powerful, not the most famous, but the most necessary. Anastasia of Astora at Firelink, voiceless and dedicated. The daughters of chaos in their deep warmth. The firekeeper of Anor Londo, whose sole occupation was the bonfire in the Great Hall. They were the infrastructure of persistence, the reason that dying was not the end of trying. When Lothric of Karim murdered Anastasia, for her soul, for the power it contained, for the calculation that her life was worth less than what he could gain from its ending, the bonfire at Firelink went cold in a way that was immediately palpable, a loss felt in the bone before it was understood in the mind. Retrieving her soul from Lothric's position high in the undead church, defeating him there in the space he had claimed, and returning the soul to the cold bonfire to rekindle it, was not merely a mechanical task. It was the thing the story was saying about firekeepers, and about what their loss meant, and about what the willingness to pursue the restoration of warmth, at cost to oneself, meant about the one who pursued it. The endings available to the undead at the kiln of the first flame were not truly endings in the way that a chapter's final sentence is an ending. They were instead transitions, the world before and after each choice continuing to exist in some form, shaped by the choice but not concluded by it. Linking the fire meant becoming what Gwyn had become, the next great fuel for the cycle, burning away the specific self in service of the general warmth. The flame would surge. The age of fire would continue. The undead would not survive the linking in any form that retained what they had been, but the thing they had cared enough about to sacrifice themselves for would persist for a while, for another iteration, for another age of fire that would eventually begin to fade and eventually produce another chosen undead and eventually culminate in another choice at another kiln. The cycle was what mattered. The individuals who maintained it were interchangeable in the mathematics of cycles. Refusing to link the fire meant stepping back, letting the embers die, allowing the darkness to gather. What the age of dark would be, whether Katie's vision was accurate, whether the humans were truly the rightful inheritors of a world freed from the gods' design, whether darkness was simply another way of being rather than the absence of being, was unknown. The primordial serpents had their perspectives, and their perspectives had proven to be perspectives rather than truths, on enough occasions that trusting them entirely seemed unwise. The Age of Dark might be what they said it was. It might be something else entirely. The only way to know would be to choose it and to find out. The fire faded either way, eventually. The question was when and who chose when, and what the choosing meant about the world that came after. In the quiet that follows every great choice, in the space between one age and the next, there are always the things that were left behind. The stories that did not end with the ending of the story they were nested within. The people who kept going after the moment that everything was supposed to resolve. Solaire, if he had found his son, if the care had been taken, if the covenant was held, if the moment in Lost Izalith had gone differently from the way it might have gone, carried his golden armor and his genuine joy into the kiln, and stood at the side of the one he had called friend. And what his son turned out to be, what the thing he had been looking for all along had actually been, was perhaps the most generous interpretation the story offered of what was worth seeking. Not power, not salvation, not the restoration of something ancient, just light, just the warmth of being, for a moment, genuinely accompanied. Siegmeyer's conclusion, however it went, was a man who had been consistently helped by someone who cared and who had, by the end, become something that caring about could no longer help. His daughter was there, or she was nearby, and that was either a comfort or the specific torture of helpless witness that love becomes when the one loved goes somewhere love cannot follow. The crestfallen warrior had known from the beginning that this was how it ended. He had been there before the chosen undead arrived, and he would be there in some form when the choice was made. His function was not to be saved. His function was to be the truth that the world told about some of its inhabitants, that knowledge of the difficulty is not always accompanied by the energy to overcome it, that some people see clearly and cannot find the strength to move toward what they see, and that this is a failure of nothing but fortune, that it is not a moral failing, but a human one. The firekeeper at Firelink, with her restored soul and her returned warmth, asked nothing of what the undead brought back. She wanted only to tend the fire, to keep the warmth available, to be what firekeepers had always been, the still point around which the movement of the world organized itself. She was exactly what she was, entirely, with no desire to be anything else. The world of Dark Souls carries its history in the way that the most honest things carry their histories, openly, without flattering revision, with the willingness to show the failure alongside the achievement, the corruption alongside the intention, the hollow alongside the whole. It is a world that believes deeply in the value of trying, not because trying always works, but because not trying definitely doesn't. Every undead who hollowed had tried for as long as they could. Every knight standing at an empty post was trying, in the only way left available to them. Every firekeeper tending her bonfire was trying, in the most quietly important way imaginable. The world does not reward trying with success. It rewards trying with more trying. It offers another bonfire ahead, another passage to traverse, another terrible thing to face in the dark. And the question it refuses to answer definitively, the question it holds open with the deliberateness of something that knows the answer is less important than the asking, is whether that accumulation of trying is in the end enough. The gods had tried. Gwyn had tried so hard that he consumed himself in the trying. The Witch of Izalith had tried and created chaos. Artorias had tried and was consumed. Oscar had tried and died at the gate with one act of generosity left in him, dropping a flask through a grate to someone he had never met, on the basis of a prophecy that might have been hope wearing the costume of certainty. And the undead from the asylum had tried, all the way from the cell to the kiln, through every ruin and every fog gate and every darkness that the kingdom had accumulated in its long decline, adding trying to trying, until the accumulation became something that looked very much like being the chosen one, whether or not it was. The first flame dims, the embers cool, the dark gathers at the edges of things, as it has always gathered, as it will always gather. And in the quiet of it, in the specific quiet that comes when something enormous has finished, the world continues, which was perhaps all it ever needed to do. The cycle persists. The ash remembers, and somewhere in the dark, a bonfire still burns. Sleep now, if sleep has not already come. The kingdom of Lordran rests tonight in its grey and amber ruins, in its fog-wrapped valleys and its hollow streets, in the warmth of its bonfires and the patience of its dark. Whatever choice was made at the kiln, the world that follows is the world that always follows, the world that goes on quietly in the spaces between one age and the next, carrying its memories in its stones and its grief in its silence and its hope in the small, persistent fires that someone, somewhere, decided were worth tending. The dragons stand in Ash Lake. The garden grows over Ulyssile. The bells do not ring again, and the first flame, whatever remains of it, burns in the dark at the center of everything that was built around it, warm and fading and enough for now to see by. Rest now. The story endures as it always has through every ending.